This is my podcast session. Today I'll have three of my friends joining me. Eli. Hello. Isabel. Hi. Hi. And they're here to discuss why European colonization sucked, specifically the Latin America. So Julius and I are from the Dominican Republic, which is in the Caribbean, but it's also a Latin American country. And you are from where?
I'm just from New York.
Ethnically.
Russian.
Okay. And you?
I'm Italian. Sorry,
guys. Yes. And so we are here to talk about why European colonization sucked for everyone in Latin America and how that has continued to affect gender as we know it today. So, the historical context, just so that we can get a good understanding. European conquerors and colonizers arrived in Latin America, specifically Christopher Columbus, and they arrived on the coast of Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica in 1502. With them, they brought several diseases like smallpox, measles, whooping cough, chickenpox, bubonic plague, typhus, and malaria. Whew. Dirty. Very, very dirty. Along with this, the indigenous population ended up declining by 89% by 1650. My apologies. Indigenous people were displaced, enslaved, they were ethnically cleansed, and they endured war post-European arrival. And basically in this region, the French, Spanish, Portuguese, and British were competing for dominance, which as a result affected the people living there. This produced mass inequality, gendered issues, racialized institutions, and elitism. So, a general, understanding of how gender seemed to work was European Catholicism and colonization ended up affecting how indigenous men and women viewed one another and how they viewed their respective roles, and how they interacted with one another in society. It also affected their interpretations of European men and women as being above them in the social hierarchy and being a group of people to respect and to fear, compared to them just all being on the same level. So this created issues between indigenous men and women. This created the idea of machismo and marianismo. So machismo is basically an aggravated or aggressive version of masculinity. It basically describes toxic masculinity, but how it existed in Latin America after the Europeans had arrived. It also resembles bravery, honor, dominance, and masculinity as well. And then Marianismo, which is based on the Virgin Mary, or Maria, like her name is said. It's basically just a cultural concept where women are morally and spiritually superior to men. Refers to virtuous, pure, self-sacrificing, feminine, and spiritually strong, rooted in Roman Catholicism and reference to the Virgin Mary. So, this gender structure has evolved over time and has hosted a very violent treatment towards women and LGBTQ individuals in Latin America. It punishes those that don't fit within gender stereotypes or roles or expectations that were given through European colonization and Catholicism. And it has basically made it so that this area is inhabitable for those who don't fit within those gender roles. So, just to start you guys off, do you guys have any prior experience with extreme gender roles in your, society or when you were growing up? How do you guys interpret extreme gender roles? How do they make you feel, et cetera, et cetera?
Personally, I never really experienced anything growing up. I was never forced into like a super hyper feminine role or hyper masculine role or anything like that. But around me, I definitely saw it reflected on peers, especially peers who grew up in very religious households. But personally, I never experienced it. However, I definitely recall hearing some like comments like, "Oh, you know, that's not feminine enough, or that's not masculine enough," and such and such. Isabel?
Okay. So laughing already. When, I would say I like definitely going through middle school and high school. I had a lot of people kind of judging the way that I acted and judging the way that I chose to go against. I would say like traditional gender roles. I think it's very interesting because we all, in some ways, go against traditional gender roles. And just dealing with some of the judgment from my family members, from my peers, from my friends about stuff that I was doing that wasn't acceptable was, I don't know, very common for me.
Any attempts to make me feminine was shut down by me, so it didn't really work. But but I would say in Dominican Republic, it was very it was very, oh my god. Cut that out. I'm gonna restart. Any attempts to make me feminine was shut down by me, but in Dominican Republic, I would see it with my cousins, how they were forced to go to church and wear these dresses, and how they were taught that if they were pregnant, they can't abort it and they would have to be mothers. And I think that in Dominican Republic, they're very strict with, the females, and they're very strict with how they should present themselves and who they should date. And if they do get pregnant, then they can't really make that decision for themselves. Whereas the men, all they really get is just not hurt females, which doesn't really work. So,
Yeah, I would agree. As a Dominican myself, I've experienced like a disparity in the way that women and girls are treated compared to how men and young boys are treated. There are definitely a heavier set of expectations. And while the expectations that fall on men are still very existent and very real, the way of going about enforcing them onto each gender was very different. And basically has kind of fostered a very violent environment for those who don't, as I already said, don't fall within those gender norms. Like femicide, Latin America has at least one femicide per 100,000 women. In the Dominican Republic, it's 2.4 per 100,000 women. And this is basically seen in about 11 out of 18 Latin American countries. And evidently, we also find that 60% of femicides are done by a partner or ex-partner, which definitely highlights that machismo and marianismo complex and how they interact with one another. And it's something I saw very often as I grew up. Women expecting to be pure and virtuous and respectful and kind, and then men being encouraged to act more aggressively, assert dominance, and control those around them and be the one that is leading everything. And so I've saw people like that, people who don't fall within those standards, be punished through violence or through the social repercussions of being ostracized or treated differently. I myself have experienced the same thing. So, yes, Jan Bettman wrote a journal article called Women, Colonization, and Racism. And she spoke a lot about the colonized women and the colonizing women and how their roles are different, how they are perceived differently, especially in applied here in the context of Latin American society. And her quote says, colonizing women were generally represented as pure, non-sexual mothers, civilizing influences on their men. They were the property or possessions of their men in their community. Their fidelity and the restriction of their sexual relations to same-race men were essentially part of keeping the race pure. I want to know what you guys think that this highlights about the neglect and the abuse of Latin American indigenous women of the time period when they were beginning to be colonized. Does anyone want to?
So I felt that this quote really helped summarize like what the true purpose of like these instilled roles was, which was to control and dominate over women. And it like summarizes like why it happens and the fact that they were forced to being submissive and how they were kept in that role and are forced to stay there today. Everyone, I felt like the quote kind of showed how European colonizers kind of looked at indigenous people, and especially through the role of their women. Because if you're gonna, justify your colonialism, your treatment of this group of people, you have to dehumanize them. You have to make them seem like these savages, these subhuman people. And if you're gonna, which we see with how they treated the native people of Latin America. But then if you're going to do that, if you're going to say this group of people is subhuman, you can't share any characteristics with them. You have to be the antithesis to these people. So I think that's seen, and like at the same time that they're pushing down these Latin American people, they also have to puff themselves up, and they have to make themselves seem, oh, look at us and our women. They're so pure. They're so motherly. They're non-sexual. They're nothing like these subhuman, savage native women. So I think you see kind of how they use women and police women, I think going off what Eli was saying, to like not only control women of their culture, but also push down the Latin American women.
To kind of piggyback off of what Isabel is saying, Native women were not seen as women, they were seen as prizes to be claimed, since a lot of European culture is based on creating kingdoms and based off who has more control and who is elected as king or mayor of this certain part of the country. So when they were able to expand and they were able to find all these new rich cultures, they have a sense of purpose in their life, something that people can look back to and something that people can, I guess, look up to so that their names are written in history, while at the same time they're also destroying another person's history. They're ruining these women. They're tearing down these kingdoms that Latin America has. And even now, a lot of the cultures and a lot of the language that these Native women and these Native men had are destroyed because of the ego that European men had.
I agree with all of what you guys just said. I also think it's pretty important to highlight that the rape of indigenous women was essential to reproducing these gender roles. It allowed for a normalization of violence towards these women from European men and also indigenous men alike, which just only like exacerbated these expectations and how severe the repercussions would be if people failed to adhere to them. And this reinstating and reproducing of violence towards indigenous women rather than to colonizing women just continued to perpetuate the patriarchal norms and the sexual violence itself, only making it harder for the women already there, and then also making the men, the indigenous men, feel that they had to participate in the system in order to, like Julia said, amount to the history that these European men were creating for themselves while jeopardizing their own history and the history of their women and the safety of their women. In reality, I say when people are talking about gender, they're usually framing it in a way that assumes that women are victims of gender roles and expectations. And while this is very possible and real and has been evident throughout history, especially in Latin America, everyone is responsible in the reproduction of gender roles. Everyone can participate in that system. Anyone can make a comment or make a judgment or enforce something upon someone else that may seem harmless, but can have the effect that this had in its time. And so I feel like in conversations like this, people fail to be mindful of that. But I also think it's important to mention that it didn't only just affected the indigenous women, but deeply affected them as a whole. Okay, so my second discussion question is, what were the impacts on gender expression and sexuality by European colonialism and Catholicism in Latin America?
I would say I did research on this. in Taino and Native American culture, like Cherokees and stuff, they viewed people who were attracted to the same sex or who had gender dysphoria as like spiritual beings, as these gods, as someone that was sent to them because it's just different from their society, but they didn't treat it as differently as we do now. They didn't treat it with discrimination. So when the Europeans had colonized a lot of the Native Americans and a lot of the Taino people, they enforced these gender rules, and now these transgender people back then and these people who were gay or lesbian or bisexual were seen as less. So a lot of that queer history and a lot of the transgender history that goes back to like the 1600s or goes back to when natives were first around were just completely destroyed just because of, colonization.
I just wanted to make a quick note of something. In history, homosexuality was very practiced before colonization. The Mochicha and Chimu cultures from the Inca Empire were also very known for their homosexual ceramic art, and Inca women would have multiple sexual partners, regardless of their sexuality, and would also participate in community decisions, and this was prior to European colonization.
I felt like going off of what Julia said, not only did it change the way gay and queer people were perceived, but it also introduced the idea of women only being good for kids and the idea that women only serve the purpose to reproduce and get pregnant and that they cannot have a sexual partner out of just life fulfillment, but in order to only get pregnant. And it also reinforced the idea of women being submissive and, again, only being good for kids and only being good if they were loyal to a man and would provide multiple children.
Yeah, I agree. Just the fact that this is like such a beautiful society with such a thing as gay ceramics, which I'm gonna be honest, I saw that in the reading that Kylie provided. I did not really know what gay ceramics is, but it sounds amazing.
Sexual ceramic art. So ceramic.
Like a dildo.
No. Restart. No, just to be clear for those watching, and I am keeping that in the video, because you want to be funny. Homosexual ceramic art was just ceramic art that depicted. Was just ceramic art that depicted homosexual actions, relationships between homosexual individuals. Just like any normal art that you would see about heterosexual individuals.
Okay. So like Brokeback Mountain ceramics, like.
I'm about to get
Brokeback Machu Picchu.
I don't even know what the word
is. Anyways, like, and they had women who were equals in their society, and they had these amazing gay ceramics. And then you have these Europeans.
You need to lock in.
Anyways, so you have this beautiful society with all of their like gay culture and all their acceptance of women and of gay people, and then you get the patriarchal Catholic Europeans coming in, and I mean, they really did, and I really think a lot of that. I mean, it's two things. Obviously, it's their culture, it's their gender rules, and it's really their religion. I feel like is a lot of it. I mean, you have this patriarchal religion that centers men, and I don't know a lot about exactly how they spread this religion onto the South or the people of Latin America. I was going to say they tend to, even now, like they either tend to force people to join, like, oh, like take this Bible or we're going to kill you, or it's like kind of like some kind of exchange, like, oh, we'll give you this weaponry, this whatever, we'll teach our children, but you have to read the Bible as well. So some kind of thing where they're not really voluntarily choosing to join this religion, but through their circumstances, however, they're really adopting this religion. And if you tell this group of men, hey, here, come join this religion, this patriarchal religion, where you'll have all this power over women and you're actually the superior group. People love being told that they're superior and that they're great. So I really think that like just the religion of it all really transformed this culture.
Gay ceramic arms. Truthfully, the institutionalization of religion has shaped and influenced the world, sometimes positively, but has proven to be very negative. We could even bring this to what's happening currently in Iran. Although they have not been colonized by any European country before and are the only nation in the Middle East that has not been colonized at all, it's insane that without even having to do what they have done to the Latin American indigenous individuals, they were able to just warp how Iranian men and women viewed one another and their roles. They were able to change their beauty standards from, fuller women with, hairy facial features, et cetera, which were even accentuated through using makeup like mascara on their upper mouth area, on their mustaches, or on their eyebrows. Like the fact that that was seen as beautiful and something that could be cherished and appreciated and something that was accepted to then being something that was demonized and criticized and laughed at simply by these people just stepping in and being like, look at our women, look at our prized possessions, look at how they present themselves and how they are pure, and your women are not this way, and that is why you are failing as a nation. That is why you guys are not as advanced as we are, not as organized and modernized as we are, because you guys are savages and stick to these free interpretations of gender rather than creating these rigid roles for men and women. And so it's just really interesting. Like they didn't even have to do too much in there. They were just like, hey, Iran, y'all are chopped. Y'all are chopped and y'all need to figure this out right now. And they did. So if you even compare that to what happened in Latin America, you can already see the influence that European colonizers had through Catholicism and how functional it is, as Isabel said, to make people feel that they're superior, and then that will incentivize them to want to maintain that superiority through their rigid gender roles and through the poor treatment of those who don't fall within them. It's hot as hell in this. We finna burn me. Well, that's what the Catholics said would happen with the gays.
From France right now. He knows what he's doing.
He died yesterday. Oh, she gonna not recorded this today. That's over. I'm gonna not burn.
Cut this one. Just have to cut this out. Wednesday, 9/11. What? Yeah, what is it?
Okay. I already mentioned what is happening or what has happened to Iran's gender roles, but now there is a current sex change solution happening in Iran currently. According to Ali Hamadani's video on Iran's sex change solution, how are Iran and Latin America's views on gender expectations similar and or different due to colonial influence? And as I've already said, Iran has never been colonized, but has been deeply influenced by European colonialism, or just by Europeans in general. You want to take it?
So I felt that there are a few similarities and a few differences with how like gender roles are there, and I felt that the idea of dislike of gay people is very similar. That hate and like I don't know how to word it, but homosexuality is frowned upon in both areas. Yet being transgender is also frowned upon more so in Latin America, but in Iran it is the solution to homosexuality. And I felt like that was kind of a way to push people back into traditional gender roles that they were influenced on by these colonials who brought these traditional gender roles.
I was cut that out.
We gotta have a blue. Well, that's what I'm gonna have.
Oh no. I would say that this just ties into when insecurity comes into organized religion, since Islam is really tied to Christianity and Judaism, where they promote women being modest, women being feminine, women being these providers for their children and staying home and cooking and worshiping their husbands. So when a lot of Islam took over the Middle East, the Iranians, I guess, they just latched onto these gender roles and the fact that a lot of these like Bibles and all these support male superiority, how they're the providers, how they're the protectors, how they need to have women or multiple women, in fact, how they need to have these children. They realize that they can control women just by using these books. So even though Iran has not been colonized, they still have the effects of colonization.
Yeah, I agree with what I blanked on your name. I forgot his name. I was like, all right, sorry. I agree with what Julia said a lot, especially about how, in some ways, you're replacing one religion that centers men with another by replacing Catholicism with Islam. Like, women, especially in Islam, they have obviously very rigid gender rules. And I think it was the whole concept of like the whole video about the Iran sex change thing was kind of shocking. Like, it's so weird to be so accepting of trans people, where in America we kind of find that gay people are on average more accepted than trans people, and then to be like really, really against gay people. And they weren't even really for trans people. Like, trans people still had some, they weren't fully accepted, but I found it very interesting how like they found a gendered solution to homosexuality. They were like, oh, you're a woman, you're attracted to other women, you just have to become a man. And it just kind of shows in some ways how bizarre so many gender rules are, and how bizarre such rigid, strict gender rules are, that you're literally telling gay people to transition into another gender just so they can not be, just so they can go with gender rules. And it kind of shows how gay people threaten the people who believe very strongly in gender roles. They're very threatening to people like that, because they're kind of gender failures in a way, and they're kind of like they're like they're like gender failures, and like to those people, and they kind of show how fragile the system and the belief in these really rigid gender rules are. And I kind of wanted to add to the point of like the question that I think a lot of queer couples get, which is, oh, who is the man in the relationship? Who is the woman in the relationship? And it's such a ridiculous question, but it's also just shows how people who believe in really rigid gender rules think. They think that, well, who's the man and who's the woman? Because you two can't possibly just be two people in a relationship, and it just shows the fragility of this belief system about how rigid these gender rules are. Thank you.
I would like to say that Thailand has never been colonized before, but the fact that a majority of the people there believe in Buddhism, which is a religion of freedom, a religion of peace, a religion where anyone can be anything they want to be as long as they don't really murder, they don't rape, they don't steal, they don't like disrespect life, is just really bizarre to me, because it shows how the three Abrahamic religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which really focuses just on how to control women rather than how to be free, is just what's the word I'm trying to look for? It just shows how there's a lot of fragility way back then about gender roles, and a lot of fragility of how people can control one another, when the concept of just letting someone live was just not wrapped in their minds.
I agree. I also feel like it's really interesting to see how these rigid and destructive gender rules can transcribe through religions. And it's just really symbolic of the fact that even religion isn't the only main reproducer of these gender roles. It can exist outside of religion, and it can still be just as influential if you don't tell people, hey, you're going to die if you don't do this, or you're going to go to hell if you do this. Like it works just as well to give people a superiority complex, and then to have them demean those who they find are below them, even outside of religion. And this is exactly what we've seen in Latin America. Was that your stomach? I Okay. And this was seen heavily in Latin America, where although this is through religion, of course, as I've already said, European Catholicism promoted heteronormative views and standards, and then kind of regarded homosexuality as deviant and evil and unmentionable, something that shouldn't even be treated as a daily or natural occurrence, something that should be demonized. And yeah, I feel like that is something very prevalent around the world in which European influence had was long enough to grasp, I guess. And yeah, it's very the connections between how Iran and Latin America viewed their gender roles due to European colonization or influence just highlights, as you guys have said, the very fragile and destructive norms that they had, reproduced and put onto these people. I'd like to read some statistics just on LGBTQ violence. A study done in 2019 by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights reported 1/3 of Latin Americans lost someone due to anti-LGBTQ violence. 1/6 of respondents had to move abroad due to anti-LGBTQ violence, similar to Iran, where people had to move abroad if they did not consider or go through with the sex change solution, did not want to change their sex to match their sexuality. 29% of respondents felt their rights were violated for being LGBTQ in the last 12 months, and 45% of respondents report feeling discriminated against for their sexuality or gender identity. And as we know, unfortunately, trans women end up suffering the most in these contexts because not only are they men who are failing to adhere to those gender roles, but it's almost as if in the eyes of European Catholicism, they are attempting to impersonate what is supposed to be pure and what is supposed to be virgin-like and what is supposed to be clean. Something that's supposed to be untouched being replicated by someone who is a man. And
so trans women can't reproduce, which is like the main reason like Catholicism focuses on like women being the provider of a family. Most trans women cannot biologically have a kid, and that's also why they're frowned upon.
Yes. So it's just really interesting to see the parallel between countries, even though they're the rate of influence by which Europe had by which Europe had ended up controlling or influencing these countries may be different. Not countries, sorry, Latin America is not a country. But I don't even know what the fuck I was talking about because people came in. Anyway, although the rates at which these groups were influenced is very different, and in Latin America proved to be more severe than in Iran, you can definitely see the parallels in which how they view their gender, how they view one another, how they reproduce gender rules, etc., etc. Okay. How are machismo and marianismo harmful in Latin America? As I already mentioned, machismo is basically an aggravated or aggressive version of masculinity. It's basically this Spanish version of toxic masculinity. It can also be associated with bravery or honor, but it's usually the first rather than the second. And marianismo is a culture concept where women are morally and spiritually superior to men. Refers to virtuous, pure, self-sacrificing, feminine, and spiritually strong, rooted in Roman Catholicism and reference to the Virgin Mary. In Latin America, machismo is more of a known term than marianismo is, because even then they don't even regard this role as something that women should be aware of. They just kind of impose it on them and then force these women and girls to kind of figure it out along the way, while also being punished for not doing so, for not having the playbook in front of them. And it's basically just wanting them to replicate the vision of the Virgin Mary in European Catholicism. Probably wrong, but whatever. But yes, I believe I asked my question. I'll ask it again. How are machismo and marianismo harmful in Latin America?
I would say machismo is definitely more harmful in Latam because a lot of these like roles expected of men where if they get angry, it's kind of your fault that they get angry, or that if your husband comes home, you have to have meals prepared for him. If not, then he is going to be angry because he's this like tall, strong dude. He's the provider and all that. And a lot of this like anger that they impose on these men can connect to a lot of abuse rate. It can connect to a lot of the abuse rates and a lot of the reason why women in Latin America don't necessarily rat out their husbands is because they are seen as to be these like these feminine pure beings where they can't necessarily like oppose or take down demand. They can't like go against their husbands. So the idea of machismo is just ruining young men in Latin America, and it's just making women more fearful to report their husbands when they are violent.
Yeah, I think that was very smart. Stop the laugh. Okay. First of all, I want to talk about how I think gender roles are really stupid, and people actually like. I think this is going off what you said earlier about even people who don't really believe in religion, people who wouldn't really call themselves extremely religious, really truly believe in gender roles. They really believe that there's a huge biological difference between men and women that makes us predisposed to be good at some things and good at others, and or not good at others. And honestly, I mean, gender roles just as our societies, they vary across time, they vary across culture, they vary across geographic regions, and
solid.
exactly, and it's not it's a performance in a way. Gender is not objective. Gender is not biological, and like a lot of like if we brought the founding fathers, George Washington and all them, to current time, and they were wearing their wigs and their cute makeup, we know what we would call them. We would call them femboys, bro. We wouldn't call them the founding fathers. We wouldn't call them the founding fathers. Sorry. So which one is it? Are gender roles biological, or were the founding fathers femboys? Like which one? Anyways, sorry. No, I'm getting to my point now. I promise. I had to get that out. Anyways, like these really rigid gender roles that push women and men into hyper masculinity or hyper femininity really just limits everyone. Gender roles really limit everyone. There are a small subsect of people that would fall into this hyper masculine or hyper feminine category, but pushing everyone based on your gender into this category, I think, is super harmful. It strips women of their autonomy, of their choice. It strips them of their rights, of their freedoms that they deserve. It makes men feel entitled to women. It makes them feel like that they're their possessions, that they own them, and that they're entitled to these women, that they're entitled to their labor, that they're entitled to their bodies. And it's just extremely harmful. And I think it's really reductionary. The way that they just take all of your personality, everything about you, and put it into a box. Yeah. And I think that kind of just shows how it limits people. It limits people's choices. For women, it limits their autonomy, and as Julius mentioned, it also hurts men as well. I mean, we obviously focus on how it hurts women because it reduces their choices and their autonomy, but men as well are put into these boxes that they don't fit in, and it the same way as women, and it makes them deeply unhappy and deeply unsatisfied in their lives.
Yeah.
Also, just a small add-on to what Isabel said. I feel like those stereotypical roles play heavily into femicide, which is not something we're going to talk about.
Yes.
But yeah, those roles definitely help feed into it, especially with the idea of complete male dominance and complete female submission.
All of this in regards to Latin America and how the Europeans had used Catholicism to kind of herd these people and divide them in a way and differentiate them so deeply that, as I've already said 1,000 times, exiting that differentiation, merging, becoming something other than what you were assigned has its repercussions. It just produced this toxic culture surrounding gender. And in a way, Marianismo makes it so that women must be submissive in Latin America. Women must respect men, must not let themselves overtalk men, must be, quiet, must be cute, must be whatever it may be, to avoid having a man feel emasculated, to avoid having a man feel angered when he is not given what he is entitled to. And as Eli has said, this obviously contributes to the high rates of femicide. And it's just interesting. Like, these European colonizers came in and gave these people roles that they will never, ever, ever properly adhere to, because gender's made up. It's just not real. And so they raped them and enslaved them and put them to work based on how their gender would incorporate, slave labor, what their task would be in terms of what their gender was. And they created such a large differentiation that these people would never be able to amount to. They would never be able to amount to the strong, honorable, and brave image of a European man and the virtuous, pure, and self-sacrificing image of a European woman. And it just created strife between indigenous men and women in Latin America and produced that violence that we are seeing so much of today. As I've already mentioned, the high rates of femicide, I believe it was 60%.
60%.
Yes. Say that again for me.
60% of all femicides are committed by an ex-partner, typically a male.
Yes. So that is what we'll be discussing next. But since it kind of just relates, this entitlement, this feeling that you are not going to amount to the image of a European man if you do not make an indigenous woman submit to you and be yours to control, like a European would a European woman. So this has just altered the indigenous people's culture from something that, as Julius mentioned, accepted everyone through a lens of peace and supported all people and kind of even like worshiped those who weren't like everyone else, to something that demonizes those who don't fall into those roles, those who look different than what the average man or average woman is supposed to look like through European Catholicism, and directly just demonizes indigenous men and women who will never fit the standards of European Catholicism in terms of gender. Lord have mercy. That was a lot, yeah. So as I already mentioned, the next question, which is also our final one, pertains to. Did I?
So as I've already explained, this section of the video has lost its audio, so I will be doing a solo recording session regarding the 2 questions that were left out because the audio had cut out. So the next question was, how has European gender roles impacted the treatment of LGBTQ individuals in LATAM today? And the last question is, what does 60% of femicides being committed by a partner or ex-partner in LATAM tell us about the effects of colonial gender rules? And I'm going to compile these 2 questions into one because they are definitely related. And then I'm going to discuss a final issue that is more modern day and less general. It's less focused on Latin America itself and is more generalized. But it's a current trend that is happening, which definitely relates to this topic. So pertaining to those 2 questions, as a bisexual individual myself and as a woman, I am from Latin America, specifically from the Caribbean. As I've mentioned in this video, I've had firsthand experience with violence and sexual assault. I have had firsthand experience with abuse from partners, abuse from family members, abuse towards women in Latin America is very common, whether it is from a partner or from a parent or perhaps even a friend. It is all very common, unfortunately. And in reality, as I've mentioned in this video, European colonization set the precedent that it was okay to harm indigenous women and it was okay to repress people because of their sexuality, and that there were certain behaviors that women should execute and that men should execute, which when they do not participate in gender roles properly, when they do not adhere to the performance that they have been given through European colonization, they are ostracized and they are treated violently and they are socially repressed. My friend Eli, I believe before the audio was going to cut out, said that 60% of femicides in Latin America are caused by a partner, ex-partner. Puerto Rico reported that 100% of femicides were caused by a partner or ex-partner. I'm Dominican and I'm also Puerto Rican, which I did not mention in the video, of course, because that was just my choice. But yes, so violence is a very prevalent thing towards those who do not follow the rules, towards those who choose to live outside the boundaries of European colonization. And the conversation that I hear very often surrounding European colonization, whether that be in the Middle East or in Asia or in the Americas, is that it was so long ago. Why are we still talking about this? And what a lot of people fail to realize is that these issues are generational. They don't just disappear. They don't just stop when you pass legislation to criminalize that behavior. They don't just stop when someone says, we can't do this anymore. They are continuous. They are social and political issues that will continue unless there is reform to the system that those rules inhabit. So I wanted to discuss a current issue that I have been seeing on TikTok and Instagram. There is a trend where European individuals post to funk music, which is Brazilian music, funny enough, and they are captioning their posts with "never mix," and the person recording these videos is usually a conventionally attractive individual with Eurocentric features. So they appear to be from Europe, blonde hair, light colored eyes, pale skin, and overall generally attractive. With comments like "don't mix," "never mix," "white is right," referring to people of color as slurs, basically referring to them as subhuman and saying that to mix with an indigenous person, or not indigenous, but to mix with a person of color is to taint your race, is to ruin your race. And additionally, there will also be comments on the videos of interracial couples, which can be in any context. An interracial couple could be just on a date together, or they could just be showing off their partner, and people from this same trend will go into these comment sections, call them slurs, say "never mix," say "get these people out of our countries," "get these people away from our women," because it's usually when the woman is white and when the man is not white that these comments come about. When the woman is a person of color and the man is white, there are less comments like that because it seems like these individuals are more defensive over European women than they are women of color. And so bringing this back to Latin America, DR, the Dominican Republic, had a dictator named Rafael Trujillo. I think I'm getting that name right. And I will put an image of him. He wanted to whiten the Dominican race. If you look on the map, Haiti and the Dominican Republic are very close to one another. They're next door neighbors. They're on the same island. And a lot of Haitians live in DR. And Trujillo wanted to get rid of these people, killing them off, making them speak in Spanish to test if they had an accent, and then beating them to death or just killing them on the spot in an attempt to whiten the Dominican race, because Haitians definitely have more Afrocentric features and appear darker, whereas Dominicans can vary in color. I myself am pretty light, but there are some Dominicans who appear way darker in complexion than I am. And when I have been seeing these videos around, it made me think of this, because this need to whiten the race, this need to separate themselves from people of color, to say we should not mix with your races because we are superior, is interesting because it's in response to their European ancestors defying that in the name of modernization and industrialization and manifest destiny, and in the name of their religion that they wanted to spread. They themselves didn't follow the never mix whatever quote, if you want to call it that. They were mixing all the time, forcing the mixing against the will of indigenous women and indigenous men as well. And so I just found that very interesting and also sad in a way. And there have been a lot of response videos where people of color who are also conventionally attractive, except they don't have Eurocentric features, will stitch the video and show their face and be like, I'm so glad I mixed. I'm so glad I mixed. And I look good because I am mixed. And you don't taint your race by being a mixed person or being not white. Which again warrants the same responses and even more violent responses of never mix, don't mix, we need to get these people out of our countries, we are becoming the minority, etc., etc. And I just felt that was very interesting. And again, these interracial couples are defying the relationships that Europeans had set between European individuals and, say, indigenous Latin Americans. Because the original relationship was, we came here, we are now altering your society to fit what we like and what we prefer, to fit the ideals of European Catholicism. And we will use your bodies, and we will use your labor, and we will use your society in general to further our own. And we will change yours forever. And today we have European individuals and people of color having relationships, having healthy relationships, coming together and defying this expectation of how Europeans were supposed to interact with indigenous Latin Americans, or even Asian people or African people or Middle Easterns, et cetera, et cetera. And in a way, it is a plus. It is definitely a plus. It indicates that we are moving forward, but given the current political climate, given the fact that there has been so much controversy surrounding Latin America, surrounding Hispanics, surrounding immigration, and the fact that a lot of white Americans feel that they are being replaced by immigration and feel that they are being replaced by Latin Americans. This has caused tension. This is undoing the progress that has been made. And of course, there is no set way to erase the effects of European colonization because the effects are so large, they're so vast, and they're generational. And so undoing that system is, of course, difficult. And I would not say that we should just give up on trying, but people must try to counter rhetoric like this. People must say that this isn't right. People have to go against the norm. People cannot comply to what European colonization and Catholicism said is right, because it's not. Because what works for one society may not work for any other society. And European Catholicism and colonization didn't even work for the Europeans either. There were still gendered issues in Europe. Women were still expected to be virgins, pure, self-sacrificing, and submissive. And men were still expected to be brave and honorable and strong and masculine. And these expectations are not natural. They do not come to us naturally. It is something that we are nurtured into doing. No one is born masculine or feminine. No one is born tough or weak. Well, not physically at least, but personality-wise. These are all things that have been taught socially. And European colonization was so successful in teaching this. It was so successful in branding these ideologies onto Latin Americans, onto so many parts of the world. And a lot of Europeans today, when they are posting things like never mix, they don't consider the repercussions of what their ancestors did. And I've seen even some of them regretting what their ancestors did solely based on the fact that they wish they had never mixed at all, so that mixed people wouldn't exist. And yeah, I mean, all of these things accelerate the rate of violence among minority groups, among women and LGBTQ individuals, especially those in Latin America who come in so many different colors and so many different sizes and do not fit the norm. And as I've already said, European colonization was so successful that now even indigenous Latin Americans, even people of those countries that were non-European, enforce those roles themselves. They enforce those rules through the perpetuation of violence towards one another. It is why we see that 60% of femicides occur from a partner or an ex-partner. And the damage is evident. And so when I had seen these posts, it wasn't going to be part of my original video, and I'm honestly glad that my audio had cut out, because once I had began seeing these new posts, a very recent trend, probably in the past week and a half, I was very surprised, and I thought about it, and it was very related to the current topic. I'm not exactly sure how to undo the effects of European colonization and Catholicism on a large scale in Latin America. I try to do my part by explaining these systems and explaining these issues to my family, especially to my family in the Dominican Republic who come from low-income areas and underfunded schools which don't actually discuss history in an extensive way, or at least in a feminist way, through a feminist lens. Or don't discuss history in a way that actually shows what the Europeans did and shows the effects of it. I believe in Latin America, the Dominican Republic is the only country that has the Bible on its flag. And Catholicism is very important to Dominicans. There are many Catholic holidays. There are many events surrounding their religion. There are events called Semana Santas, Holy Weeks, where people will gather and make food and, just be together in a holy way. And so, through European Catholicism, Europeans were just able to alter these societies in a way that wasn't there before. If the Dominican Republic and the rest of Latin America had remained untouched and had remained, indigenous as it was before, they wouldn't be following this religion. They wouldn't be following a religion that was created, I'd say, or at least used on them to enslave them and rape them and to create a herd and to enforce these gender roles that they were never going to be able to accomplish, because it's just not possible. And yeah, so I hope that you enjoyed this video. I did a lot of talking, and sometimes it seems like I don't know what I'm saying, but this topic is very dear to me because I am Latin American, and I hope that you enjoyed. And yes, thank you for watching.